Hello, my darling listeners. It's me, Fiveum. This time reading a nice piece from the 1619 Project. Well, I don't know if I would call it nice. It's rather depressing, actually. And yet, how do I describe it? It's one that really struck an oddly emotional chord with me. One that, well, I want to explain it at the end. And yes, it's a chord so emotional that it made even me, Fiveum, the man, the myth, the legend, who deals only in 100% objective facts, actually felt legitimate emotion. Alrighty, let's get into this bad boy. How segregation caused your traffic jam. What does a traffic jam in Atlanta have to do with segregation? Quite a lot. By Kevin M. Cruz, initially published in the New York Times 1619 Project on August 14th, 2019. Atlanta has some of the worst traffic in the United States. Drivers there average 2 hours each week mired in gridlock, hung up at countless spots, from the constantly clogged Georgia 400 to a complicated cluster of overpasses at Tom Moreland Interchange, better known as Spaghetti Junction. The downtown connector, a 12 to 14 lane mega highway that, in theory, connects the city's north to its south, regularly has 3-mile-long traffic jams that last 4 hours or more. Commuters might assume they're stuck there because some city planner made a mistake, but the heavy congestion actually stems from a great success. In Atlanta, as in dozens of cities all across America, daily congestion is a direct consequence of a century-long effort to segregate the races. For much of the nation's history, the campaign to keep African Americans quote-unquote in their place, socially and politically, manifested itself in an effort to keep them quite literally in one place or another. Before the Civil War, white masters kept enslaved African Americans close at hand to coerce their labor and guard against revolts. But with the abolition of slavery, the spatial relationship was reversed. Once they had no need to keep constant watch over African Americans, whites wanted them out of sight. Civic planners pushed them into ghettos, and the segregation we know today became the rule. At first, the rule was overt, as southern cities like Baltimore and Louisville enacted laws that mandated residential racial segregation. Such laws were eventually invalidated by the Supreme Court, but later measures achieved the same effect by more subtle means. During the New Deal, federal agencies like the Home Owners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration encouraged redlining practices that explicitly marked minority neighborhoods as risky investments and therefore discouraged bank loans, mortgages, and insurance there. Other policies simply targeted black communities for isolation and demolition. The post-war programs for urban renewal, for instance, destroyed black neighborhoods and displaced their residents with such regularity that African Americans came to believe in James Baldwin's memorial phrase that urban renewal means Negro removal. The intertwined history of infrastructure and racial inequality extended into the 1950s and 60s with the creation of the interstate highway system. The federal government shouldered 9/10 of the cost of the new interstate highways, but local officials often had a say in selecting the path. As in most American cities in the decades after the Second World War, the new highways in Atlanta, local expressways at first, then interstates, were steered along routes that bulldozed quote-unquote blighted neighborhoods that housed its poorest residents, almost always racial minorities. This was a common practice not just in southern cities like Jacksonville, Miami, Nashville, New Orleans, Richmond, and Tampa, but in countless metropolises all around the country, including Chicago, Cincinnati, Denver, Detroit, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Syracuse, and Washington. While interstates were regularly used to destroy black neighborhoods, they were also used to keep black and white neighborhoods apart. Today, major roads and highways serve as stark dividing lines between black and white sections in cities like Buffalo, Hartford, Kansas City, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. In Atlanta, the intent to segregate was crystal clear. Interstate 20, the east-west corridor that connects with I-75 and I-85 in Atlanta's center, was deliberately plotted along a winding route in the late 1950s to serve, in the words of Mayor Bill Hartsfield, as
the boundary between the white and Negro communities
on the west side of town. Black neighborhoods, he hoped, would be hemmed in on one side of the new expressway, while white neighborhoods on the other side of it would be protected. Racial residential patterns have long since changed, of course, but the awkward path of I-20 remains in place. By raising impoverished areas downtown and segregating the races in the western section, Atlanta's leaders hope to keep downtown and its surroundings a desirable locale for middle-class whites. Articulating a civic vision of racial peace and economic progress, Hartsfield bragged that Atlanta City was
the city too busy to hate.
But the so-called urban renewal and the new interstates only helped speed white flight from Atlanta. Over the 1960s, roughly 60,000 whites left the city, with many of them relocating in the suburbs along the northern rim. When another 100,000 whites left the city in the 1970s, it became a local joke that Atlanta had become
the city too busy moving to hate.
As the new suburbs ballooned in size, traffic along the poorly placed highways became worse and worse. The obvious solution was mass transit, buses, light rail, and trains that would more efficiently link the suburbs and the city, but that too faced opposition largely for racial reasons. The white suburbanites had purposefully left the problems of the central city behind and worried that mass transit would bring them back. Accordingly, suburbanites waged a sustained campaign against the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, or MARTA for short. From its inception, residents of the nearly all-white Cobb County resoundingly rejected the system in a 1965 vote. In 1971, Gwinnett and Clayton counties, which were then also overwhelmingly white, followed suit, voting down a proposed proposal to join MARTA by nearly 4-1 margins, and keeping MARTA out became the default position of many local politicians. Emmett Burton, a Cobb County commissioner, won praise for promising to
stock the Chattahoochee with piranha
if that were needed to keep MARTA away. David Chestnut, the white chairman of MARTA, insisted in 1987 that suburban opposition to mass transit had been
90% a racial issue.
Because of that resistance, MARTA became a city-only service that did little to relieve commuter traffic. By the mid-1980s, white racists were joking that MARTA, with its heavily black ridership, stood for
moving Africans rapidly through Atlanta.
Even as the suburbs became more racially diverse, they remained opposed to MARTA. After Gwinnett voted the system down again in 1990, a former Republican legislator later marveled at the arguments given by opponents. He told a reporter,
"They will come up with 12 different ways of saying they are not racist in public. But you get them alone, behind a closed door, and you see this old blatant racism that we have had here for quite some time."
Earlier this year, Gwinnett County voted MARTA down for a third time. Proponents had hoped that changes in the county's racial composition, which was becoming less white, might make a difference, but the March initiative still failed by an 8-point margin. Officials discovered that some non-white suburbanites shared the isolationist instincts of earlier white suburbanites. One white property manager in her late 50s told a reporter that she voted against mass transit because it was used by poorer residents and immigrants whom she called illegals. She asked,
"Why should we pay for it? Why subsidize people who can't manage their money and save up a dime to buy a car?"
In the end, Atlanta's traffic is at a standstill because its attitude about transit is at a standstill too. 50 years after its interstates were set down with an eye to segregation and its rapid transit system was stunted by white flight, the city is still stalled in the past. Kevin M. Cruz is a professor of history at Princeton University and the author of White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of Modern Conservatism. When I first read this article, I was so emotionally impacted by it that not only did I have to take some time to myself, but I also did not initially notice that the article does not use the Oxford comma, and boy does that bug me. But back to the main point. Oddly enough, growing up as a white Jewish suburbanite boy, I actually envied the couple of my friends who lived in the city and did not have to drive everywhere, or rather be driven everywhere. If they wanted to meet up on the weekend, they didn't have to hope that mom or dad was free to drive them to their friend's place, or the park, or the movie theater, or wherever. I did have a bicycle, but in suburbia, where everything is sprawled miles and miles apart, that can only get you so far before the sun goes down. I will say that I did have plenty of fun with my bike and my other friends who lived close enough that I could bike with them, but I never really felt free, especially since I grew up listening to my grandfather, who himself grew up in Brooklyn, talk about how
I could ride the trains and the buses and the subways all over the place. Sometimes I would just sit on a train for hours and ride it from end to end if I didn't have anything else to do. I could go basically anywhere I wanted, as long as I had a nickel or a dime. Well, except Staten Island, but that place was basically farmland at the time. The only time I ever went to Staten as a youth was with my Boy Scout troop. We'd hike a few miles. Oh, there's a house. We'd hike another few miles. Oh, there's another house.
No, my grandfather was not Bernie Sanders, although they did both grow up in Brooklyn around the same time, and their accents reflect this. Looking back, it is kind of ironic. We as Americans tend to celebrate cars as symbols of freedom, and yet, in my youth, they were a symbol of dependence, since I could barely go anywhere without being driven by someone else. Eventually, I did get a driver's license, but not until I spent years feeling confined to my geographic neighborhood. That's just my personal story, though, and the traffic in and around my area was never really that bad, especially when compared to Atlanta. Reading this article, it put a nasty image in my mind. I imagined a driver stuck in traffic with their kids in the back seat. Their kids were hacking and coughing on the smog, and those hacks and coughs were practically being drowned out by all the horns that are blaring as the traffic rages on for what seems like forever. And yet, in their head, the driver remarks about how this is preferable to their kids having black friends. And let me tell you something, all right? I've got aphantasia. I literally cannot see things in my head. Do you have any idea just how strong of an emotional impact something has to have on me to give me mental images? Well, okay, I'll admit it. I exaggerated a little when I said mental image. Truth be told, it was less of something that I saw in my head and more of a terrible, terrible feeling I had in my gut and my chest, and I came up with the words that I will later used in this closing statement to describe the feeling that I felt. I can't see things in my head, but I can hear them pretty well if I want to, and let me tell you this, listening to kids choking amongst car horns, not a very pleasant sound to imagine. While that particular scenario was something my angry blind head came up with, the negative impacts of air pollution, as well as traffic-induced stress and possible car crashes and overall climate shit, that isn't. It actually reminded me of something I read in a book called Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy. It's not really a Facts Fiveum video unless I name-drop that man whom I hate so much. Yes, I am obsessed with him. It'll be my life goal to exorcise that demon that haunts this nation, the demon of Ben Tillman. Anyway, in particular, the book was describing the antebellum South Carolina political establishment scene, setting, whatever you call it, and the downright terror that many slave owners lived in. A lot of them were paranoid that at any given moment, one of their slaves would just snap and kill their owner. This got so bad that, okay, I don't know exactly how many of them, but at least a handful of them, maybe a bunch of them, they got together to ask if they should buy some more slaves from the state of Maryland, and they decided against it on the grounds that the state of Maryland bordered Pennsylvania, which was a free state. They feared that slaves who lived so close to a free state had ideas of freedom in their minds, and they would then bring these ideas to their South Carolina slave fellows and spread their ideas of freedom like a pox or a plague, and this would eventually lead to some sort of slave rebellion. And this shit is like, it's, what do you call it? Self-induced historical misery. You know, you got your normal historical misery. That's like,
I cut my hand and germ theory hasn't been discovered yet, so it's probably going to get infected and I got to get my entire arm cut off.
Yeah, that's just tough luck. You're born into a time period where things are miserable because society just hasn't really advanced much, and neither has science or really anything else. You can't really do much about that except wait, I guess. But then you got the self-induced stuff because, well, these slavers, they didn't have to own these slaves. They could have freed them, and then they wouldn't have to worry about being killed by a slave. And yet, they chose to live in perpetual mental anguish over this. Why did they do it? I don't know. I'm not ready to answer that question. At least not yet. And this shit right here, the misery, the traffic, the smog and the pollution, the damage to the lungs of the youth, the isolation that those suburban youth inevitably feel, that is self-inflicted shit. Well, okay, the kids themselves didn't inflict it, they can't vote, but their parents inflicted it upon them. I was annoyed to see, at the end, it talked about how other racial and ethnic groups had no issue getting in on that isolationist feeling, although the article doesn't go into too much detail about that. I kind of wish it went into a little more. Granted, though, the earliest defeat of Marta that was referenced had a 4-1 defeat, and the most recent one in 2019 was just by 8 points. Now, 8 points is a lot, but it's nothing compared to a 4-1 defeat. I know that mass transit isn't perfect, but it's honestly pretty nice. And race aside, are you willing to tell your kids that they have to stay isolated, breathe in more smog, and get stuck in hours and hours of traffic, just so that you can have someone you can look down on?
Hello, this is Fiveum, saying thank you for listening, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. If you can, please like and share it around, and if you're feeling especially generous, please subscribe. I need at least 100 subscribers to change my YouTube channel's URL, and my default is long and ugly, and I really don't like it. It would be extremely helpful for me if you subscribed. But you don't have to. I'm not your boss. I'm just Fiveum. And right now, I'm signing off.